Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today and kind of hopefully following along with CanWatch's gender equality programming for this exciting week of GE 2020. My name is Erin Jex, and I'm the Gender Equality Officer here at CanWatch, and just really want to extend my sincere gratitude to everyone who signed up to join us today. We have a limited amount of time to have a very big conversation, so we're gonna kind of jump right into it right off the bat so that we can have as much time for a collaborative discussion as possible. So welcome, and without further ado, I will turn it over to my colleague, Juanita.
Oh, hi, everybody. I'm Juanita Nana-Pergassim, and I'm a member of CanWatch's Gender Equality Group, and I'm super excited to welcome you to this session today. In my work as a community inclusion advisor for a not-for-profit in Edmonton, I've started to see a real push and an excitement for getting diversity on our boards, in our programming, in our volunteers, and that's amazing. But I've also seen that there's a real challenge to understand how to get there. And in trying to overcome that challenge, I've seen folks have this tendency towards cherry picking candidates, which has its own pitfalls, and I'm sure facilitators will touch on that, over just figuring out how to change recruitment strategies so that you naturally are getting more applicants from underrepresented populations. So I'm excited to learn something new, as this is a much needed session. And because we all know the not-for-profit sector really thrives when we all have a chance to contribute to it. So enjoy the session. We can't wait to hear your thoughts and have a great discussion afterwards.
Thank you so much, Juanita, for grounding the session and kind of providing everyone with a really great overview of where we're coming from. Just to start, I would like to introduce or have the facilitators introduce themselves, give you a little bit of a picture of who they are, where they work, and their interest and involvement with diversity, equity, and inclusion. So to start, I'll just turn it over to you, Debbie.
Hi, everyone. My name is Debbie. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the new executive director at the Canadian Centre for Gender and Sexual Diversity. So we work on anti-bullying and anti-discrimination, which fits really well with the topic today. And I'm really excited about this discussion. I'm not a specialist in the technical sense, as in I'm not an independent consultant. I didn't go to school for human resources, but I am someone who has been tokenized in work environments before. And I'm currently in a position of power where I am recruiting and I'm doing, I'm overseeing the HR practices for an organization right now. And so I'm excited because so much of this conversation is tied to my liberation as a Black queer woman who, was a child of immigrants. And I've found my voice and, really bringing focus to, more radical approaches to diversity and inclusion, and highlighting the work of other folks who this is their main gig, trying to show people where they can go to, listening to the words of folks who do this way better than I do. And so I can't wait to see where this conversation goes. I'm super excited to see, what tips I can take back to my work and office with me and kind of share those ideas and build this space together. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Debbie. Over to you, Stephanie.
Hi, everyone. My name is Steph Wiafe, and I am the Communications and Engagement Officer at HealthBridge Foundation of Canada, which is a small global equity or health equity global health organization based in Ottawa and Hanoi. And my background really is in public health and global health. And my experience with DEI really is navigating the nonprofit sector as a Black biracial woman. And my interests really lie in the Black Lives Matter movement and racial disparities in health and health equity and gender disparities in health as well. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from all of you. And my goal is to amplify voices that really need to be heard, in addition to aligning and networking with people who are really interested in equity and the Black Lives Matter movement. So thank you all for joining, and I'm really excited to have a really in-depth discussion later.
Thanks so much, Steph. And last but not least, Sydney.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sydney Piggott. I use she, her pronouns in English et pronom elle en français. I'm the Director of Programs and Projects at YWCA Canada. I'm joining you from Toronto, Treaty 13 territory. And I think, like my fellow facilitators, kind of sometimes get thrust into the equity, diversity, and inclusion space by virtue of being having experiences of tokenization or being sometimes the only racialized person or Black person in a room or queer person in a room. But my official introduction to this work was actually in grad school, where I co-founded an intersectional feminist collective in response to the very, very sad representation of professors and faculty administration when I was studying at the University of Toronto. And that's really where I kind of started to build expertise, not only in equity, diversity, and inclusion, but what I think is more important in workspaces is really anti-racism and anti-oppression. I am still learning, I think, like lots of people, and I really think this is a lifelong journey. So I'm super excited to have this conversation, to be able to share my experiences, but also to be able to learn not only from the other facilitators, but from everyone here. I think it's a great step for everyone who joined to be having this conversation in a pretty vulnerable space. So I'm really excited to hear about everyone's contributions. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for all of the panelists for joining us today. I am super excited to learn from you and with everybody in the room, to learn from each other and really kind of get to the best practices and sharing resources and having these kind of grounding conversations together and you know, being able to be vulnerable together, I think will be a really interesting practice. And seeing how vulnerability plays out on a digital sphere is also something that I'm really interested to see how that works too. With that in mind, just to kick us off and kind of ground the session, I would just ask our facilitators to kind of reflect on kind of a key question that will hopefully be a thread throughout the conversations in the breakout room. So one thing that we have been kind of talking on and reflecting on is how the work for this starts from within. So in your opinions, how can we look inwards at our own organization's internal makeup and use that really critical lens to move away from tokenism and to cast a wider net when it comes to recruitment, retainment, and upward mobility, especially we all are kind of working in this non-for-profit and development sector. So with that question in mind, maybe I'll turn it over to Steph first. If you want to have some reflections, that would be amazing. Thank you.
Sure, yeah. So I think one of the most critical points in ensuring DEI in the workplace is the hiring process. So having meaningful representation of people who are diverse in the recruitment and people who are in the interview and people and managers who are involved in selecting candidates is really, really important. And I also think that having minimum requirements or having screening questions similar to how a lot of organizations have screening questions for candidates who apply online relative to feminism and to gender equality in their application process. I think that we could include some screening questions related to diversity and racial diversity, in addition to all other types of diversity, to ensure that candidates who do move on to the next stage have some type of minimum education or minimum awareness of diversity. And then that will also ensure that those people who then move on to join an organization will have a lens that they can build upon through DEI training and within the workplace. And it will be more representative of the general population that really is diverse in reality.
Sydney, I see you nodding your head. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, for sure. I think I have kind of three things to generally summarize my feelings on this. The first one is I think that our approach to equity, diversity, and inclusion is going about it backwards. We focus a lot on diversity first rather than equity and inclusion, which I think is a huge problem because the spaces that we occupy are not necessarily safe for the people that we want to recruit into these spaces, right? We do people who are underrepresented, people who are made vulnerable, people who are marginalized in different situations a disservice when we start with diversity and don't focus on the equity and inclusion aspects first. So I really think that there's a necessity, especially in, I think, the not-for-profit social and development sector, to flip the equation and look at it from a different perspective so that when we are bringing people of diverse either identities, experiences, whatever it might be, into our spaces, that those are safer spaces for those people. I know for myself personally, I've been hesitant to hire people who on paper would look great in terms of diversity because I understand that the workplace that I'm in is not a safe space for them. And I think that that's actually a braver thing to do than to bring someone into a space that's not really equitable or inclusive for people. So I think that that's a really a critical lens that we need to apply when we look at that. The second part is something I mentioned kind of in my introduction, is that equity, diversity, and inclusion is not the same as anti-racism and anti-oppression and actually decolonizing workspaces. Those are two different or three really different tasks that we need to tackle all at once and not separately and not in silos. So I think that this is work that really needs to be done within organizations, within ourselves as individuals, and then also obviously systemically, which will be the most challenging and most difficult part in this. But something really important when we're talking about inclusion and equity is anti-racism and anti-oppression and how we're doing that within our workspaces. And then the final thing, and I really appreciated about this question, is that we shouldn't only be focusing on hiring. It really is important to focus on retention, on professional development for people of diverse identities. I'm thinking of myself as a Black queer woman. Definitely what I would be more interested to see in terms of numbers of diversity is what is the attrition rate of people like me in organizations? Are they brought into these spaces? Are they thriving? Are we really reaching our own personal development goals as well as professional development goals within organizations? And I think it's really important to look at that. I know in Canada especially, we're terrible at getting race-based data on really anything, but it would be a great step forward in terms of how we change this landscape if we could really look beyond just what the photo looks like on the website and how long those people are staying in organizations. Are they growing? Are they reaching their personal and professional development goals within an organization? I think it's hugely important. And I think it's particularly important when we talk about our sector, because I do think that we let ourselves off the hook very quickly. We think because we're working in the social sector that we maybe are innately better at doing this work than in other sectors, but that doesn't mean that we don't need training, that we don't need support in this work, and that we don't need to grow ourselves and be honest ourselves with the gaps that exist. So I really think it's important to have discussions like this where we're honest about where we need to go and where we need to develop, because if anything, we can be modeling this for other sectors.
I absolutely agree with you, especially on your last point about being a model for other sectors. Like I completely think that, you know, as people working in the development sector and as a sector that especially on the entry level and mid-level kind of positions are usually mostly, you know, the positions are held by women, we seem to think, or we kind of seem to recognize that we're doing better in that space, when in actuality, like a deeper and more critical lens inward could really, you know, show that at top level, upper level management, and especially your point on people reaching professional and personal development goals, the upper level management and kind of that top down management really isn't reflective of what the not-for-profit and the development sector really looks like in actuality. Yeah, and Debbie, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, and I was gonna say, I'm so happy for what was been shared by my co-facilitators, because I'm just like, yes, I think to situationalize this whole conversation, I was like, the first thing that needs to happen is an honest, like, admission that this industry is built on oppression. Like, it is, there's a history behind it, and I think we're very hesitant to talk about it. Because I think we're very comfortable with the, you know, we're doing good, therefore we're inherently good. And there's a history that needs to be talked about, because as a result of, you know, white supremacy, as a result of the patriarchal elements that creeps itself out in the industry of nonprofits and international development, it shows in our procedures and our policies, and we often take it for granted internally. And I often have to think about, like, who is impacted as a result of that. It's the same people who we often say are the communities our mission is serving or our mandate is serving. And so there's this, like, level of hypocrisy that ends up happening where, you know, predominantly white male workplaces who are supposed to be serving marginalized people who are predominantly Black and brown end up creating very violent workspaces, and that impact people who look like myself, which forces us to leave the industry. And so I'm really happy that Sydney brought that up, because it's true. My organization right now is currently going through anti-racism training, and the facilitator that we were able to secure amazing, because one part of her training is actually interviewing former racialized staff to ask them if racism was part of the reason why they left the organization. And there's a direct correlation there. And it's a conversation we need to have. And that's just from the like organizational side to make sure that it is a safe environment for these people. Once you do end up recruiting diverse people, you really have to ask yourselves, like, what exactly is our organization set up to do to be transformative? There are some resources that I'll share, some very radical, very progressive approaches to nonprofit work, which I think will maybe help fill the gaps that we're seeing, where they talk about, you know, the opposite of tokenism is transformation. And basically, you know, you have to ask yourselves, is our organization ready to do that? Because the part of tokenization, which is the most unfortunate part, is that dehumanization, where it's like, we want different people in our organization, but we don't want them to do different things. And that's that issue, and the empowerment word comes in. So I'm trying to not use empowerment here, but it usually goes to that. If you're not set up to empower those folks, to support them, to allow them to actually like sit in their difference and feel celebrated in that difference in that workplace, and to provide suggestions to transform your organization, they're going to leave. And that part is so important for us to look at and ask ourselves, what are we doing to set up ourselves for success? And so I really feel like there needs to be an interrogation, an honest conversation about the history of our industries, how, you know, oppressive structures kind of reproduce and creep up, challenge those things, but also be willing to, you know, make sure that we're not forcing folks who we recruit who might be diverse in whatever way to conform, because that is going to reproduce tokenism, which is a very, very harmful thing, which forces folks who are racialized, who are queer, who are trans to leave organizations, which creates this very weird cycle of not having those folks to kind of bring systemic change and cultural change in your organization. And so I feel like those things definitely need to be interrogated first for us to kind of really look at the crux of things. And yeah, there's advice and there's tips and there's people who are working on this who can definitely help you operationalize that, including in your strategic plan, which I think is another thing for folks who are working in this industry to think about honestly implementing it in the ways in which we guide our work, our mandate, and operationalize it.
No, I completely agree with that, Debbie, in terms of operationalizing it, kind of at a basic organizational standpoint. It is really hard to create change within an organization when it's not kind of being built into the framework, or you're not, you know, breaking down the framework in which you exist to then build it back up from the ground. And this kind of leads into what Sydney was saying about systemic change. You know, within our organizations, it's really hard to be critical, especially the bigger organizations that, you know, might have hundreds and hundreds of employees. It is really hard to create that change and to see that change. It's very incremental and very slow over time. So the luxury, I think, for, you know, people who are working in the not-for-profit sector and, you know, working in organizations that are 2-3 staff, that ability to pivot and respond to, you know, what the organizational needs are, and to have kind of an impact and a voice. And I'm really encouraged and, you know, I'm interested to hear about kind of the journey of CCGSD with the anti-racism training that you're undertaking. It sounds very interesting, and potentially as a resource, you could share the name or the organization that you're using to provide that training, because I think that people on the call would be very interested to know, because it sounds like it's a profound, you know, undertaking for, you know, people who are currently working at the organization, and hopefully will help foster some positive change and some really, you know, good conversations. So now that was kind of just our kickoff. So this is the opportunity for people within the plenary, if you would like to, you know, share anything from your organizations or from personal experience. I encourage you to, you know, come off mute at this point. We have a few minutes before we're going to break out into smaller breakout room sessions that will be facilitated by the wonderful people on the panel right now, or chat in the chat box and we can respond to that. And if no one is going to come off mute, we'll probably just move directly into the breakout room.
Hi, I do have a question. I'm Deanna. I work for Oxfam Canada, and we've been on our learning journey around these issues for the last little while. One thing I would love to hear from those very, very excellent panelists you have there, is sort of what is the best approach to take with this kind of work in terms of, do you go with a consultant that sort of just comes in and helps you figure out a strategy? Do you have, a dedicated staff person that looks at this, but then how do you mainstream it across the organization, right? Like, what are sort of promising approaches that you have seen that really ensure this moves forward? Because I'm just reflecting that on journeys of gender justice, while organizations hire gender experts to get to that point. Is that sort of the same approach we should be taking with this kind of work?
I think it really depends on the stage of the organization itself. I think if there's been a breakdown of trust in the past among staff who have what would be considered diverse identities or experiences, it would definitely be helpful to have a third party that is neutral. I definitely encourage, if that's the case, to talk to racialized staff, staff with disabilities, queer, two-spirit, trans staff as well, to really know who they would trust in a situation like that. Oftentimes they will have plenty of people that they do trust in that situation, and they really are the experts in their experience. So definitely drawing on that. If that's the type of situation that you have, bringing someone in externally would be great. But that's actually a lesson for any kind of process you're going through. It's really important to be centering the people who may be experiencing harm as a result of not streamlining these practices in the workplace. And, we have a wealth of knowledge. It's probably not the first time that we've experienced this, so it's definitely a good place to start. In terms of the question around having one designated staff member, I think it really depends. It's obviously better to have this kind of streamlined through an entire organization. And I think Steph pointed this, is it that every person hired has to have already had DEI training or ARAO training, or that they need to have it within their first 3 months of probationary period, something like that. And so that no matter what team you're on, you're able to have access to someone who is trained in these resources. It is nice to have this embedded into some kind of HR practice, but I don't think that that guarantees that people really have the support that they need. So I think that could be a part of a strategy. I don't think that it's really the full strategy, but my biggest recommendation always is to just truly center the people who are experiencing this and to learn from them and listen to them around what is needed in an organization. I know I'll speak for myself. I definitely have a wealth of knowledge around the supports that I need. So I can definitely speak to that to any person in an organization. And I'm sure that, creating a caucus of people who will be able to have their voices heard in a meaningful way and in a transformative way, the way that Debbie said, is definitely like a first step at doing this. And they will guide you in the right direction around how to tackle this issue.
Yeah, I echo everything you said, Sydney. And I think that it is really important to have a third party come in and assess your specific situation in your workplace. And I also think that it's really important to have someone who people can go to for their experiences that is safe. Because I think a lot of people experience tokenism and discrimination in the workplace, but they don't have a channel or a person to go to that they really trust, because oftentimes when you bring up issues related to discrimination or racism, there could be negative consequences on you for even bringing that up. So having a third party person who's objective and who doesn't necessarily have any power within the organization would also provide a channel for people to express themselves to in a safe place. And I also think, just one last thing, I really think that we can talk about different strategies to improve DEI, but at the end of the day, I really think that it's really a bottom-up approach. Like every single person needs to have done their own due diligence and to have educated themselves to a certain degree for diversity really to thrive in a workplace. And there's no quick fix to this, really. I think everyone knows that, but it's really important to understand that this will take time, and that everyone has a personal responsibility to be part of a safe workplace for every single person and every type of person.
I say, you folks have taken everything I wanted to say and shared it. So I'll just add to it. I was gonna say that, yeah, there definitely needs to be a mechanism in place where people feel safe and can trust whatever that mechanism is, because that is a big factor in people not being able to share, you know, harm that has been done to them or concerns that they have, or getting fresh perspectives on new ideas because of this fear of consequences, especially if people might be like, you know, pigeonholed into maybe more temporary work, for example, or you know, are on contract-based work, etc. And so having that mechanism in place is integral. I'm a big proponent of speaking to to consultants who are neutral third parties. The main reason is because from speaking to many women of color friends that I have, they leave the nonprofit industry to become independent consultants because it's just safer for them. And so on one hand, it's like, yes, that neutrality is needed. The other hand, I'm like, these women need to be paid. So I feel like third-party consultants are a great way to go. They can definitely help you with ideas that maybe aren't coming up within the workplace. You know, if anyone has done evaluation with consultants before, you know the drill. I think one advice I'd have is definitely don't go to a consultant that you think is going to affirm you or your feelings, especially if your management is predominantly white. And I say this because white fragility is a huge thing that people have to navigate when these conversations come up, and it is uncomfortable for everybody, and it's vulnerable for everybody. And I've seen it before where, you know, harm has been done by an organization and they're like, we're going to do training, but they choose very wisely who they're going to speak to because they want their feelings to be taken care of at the same time. And I don't think that should be the priority. The priority, as Sydney mentioned, are the people who have been harmed or will be harmed by certain systems or policies and procedures within your workplace. And so definitely have mechanisms in place, whether it's a committee or an individual, but absolutely seek out a third-party consultant, because I'm sure one of your staff members who might be diverse in whatever way probably has suggestions that will help for sure.
Juanita, do you have anything to add to that, just as someone who is, you know, doing this work in the organization that you're working with? Maybe some practical examples?
I think what everything has been said is so important. So right, like, you know, I think every approach for every organization is going to be different depending on who the people is, where they are in their own like diversity and inclusion journey and so on. I do think, you know, from my line of work, what I've seen is we really had to be creative around how we were recruiting. That was the whole issue. Like we kept recruiting using the same channels, you know, the same networks. And then obviously we were getting the same people. And then the one time a diversity person would come in, it was this whole tokenism lens, right? As opposed to like one of the things that like my organization did was we built connections with like local ethnic businesses and restaurants, and we started to post job applications and stuff there. And then we got qualified people of color applying. It was just that they didn't know that we were hiring because we weren't using the channels that were receptive to them, right? And so when you all spoke about doing that groundwork around, you know, conceptual, like, you know, the groundwork of like, where are you recruiting? Like, what is that organizational culture right now? Like those pieces are so important. And I actually have a question for the panel because this came up, you know, you all were talking around safety. And I think one of the challenges I'm having right now is like, you know, getting organizations to realize like they're actually not a safe culture. There's a lot of like racism, there's a lot of ageism, there's some unlearning that needs to be done, but because of the political and social climate, folks are so eager to start this diversity process. And I think, as you mentioned, Sydney, that can put folks into a very unsafe place. And I'm wondering, how do you open up that conversation with your organization to say, you know what, we need to put a pause on hiring folks and we need to deal with our internal culture first? Or if you have any tips for about that, which I know is a big question, but I'm just curious if you have any ideas or suggestions.
So I've been following an awesome diversity, equity, and inclusion like change maker and consultant who's based in the States named Lily Zhang. And I actually pulled this exact quote from her because it's phenomenal. And I think it's a great prerequisite for like internal work change. Like, so Lily mentions that trust is a prerequisite to any change. It's hard to build and easy to lose. Leaders, if you've lost the trust of your employees, there's still a way forward, but we'll have to clean up your mess first before we can do the aspirational stuff. And she was talking about their perspective as a consultant, and that, you know, if there are issues within an organization where trust has been broken, where, you know, there's almost like this rushed thing that you need to kind of check off is we need to do our D&I work ASAP. you really need to like interrogate what has happened, if something has happened, and I'm gonna assume most likely, admit to it and make amends. And I think that is the first thing that needs to happen before you can kind of start this process. And I think you won't get staff buy-in if you don't really interrogate the trust issue. And if, you know, external supporters are aware of maybe some issues internally, and this is something my organization is going through, they're not going to buy into it either, right? And so I feel like that is something that leaders should definitely be doing, is talking about what trust may have been broken and making amends at first, and then kind of, you know, bringing in the broader conversation of diversity and inclusion, whether it's through a training or, I don't know, tips and tricks that you can implement into your policies and procedures.
Totally. I actually have two like comments that follow directly from what Debbie said. Like, I feel like we're all building off each other in such an awesome way. This is so cool. But yeah, directly from that, I think a really big part of what's missing from equity, diversity, and inclusion work is our accountability structures are very weak. So it's really hard to move forward when there is no accountability really that exists, right? Because if you're looking at it from a systemic perspective, like our systems, at least in the country that we're living in, are not going to support the people who are experiencing the brunt of this. So it's something that we actually have to create on our own, right? But again, like Debbie said, the social sector, the development sector is founded on colonization, on a lot of white feminism, especially when we're talking about gender equity, and a lot of structures that will continue to marginalize certain groups, right? So I think that what's really important in this is how do we create accountability structures for our sector and for ourselves and our organizations that really, like I said, I feel like a bit of a broken record, but centers the people who are going to be experiencing the most harm from this. So I think that that's a big thing that has to happen. And exactly like Debbie said, it starts from really building trust and admitting when harm is caused, right? I think that there's a hesitance to admit that, like we mentioned in our sector where we think of ourselves as inherently good. It's really hard to just take responsibility for something that's caused harm or something that needs to be fixed and to grow forward from there. So I think that's a huge part of it. And then I think kind of a second part around like how we do this is similar to that, is being honest with ourselves about our workplaces and about the environments that we work in. Kind of like I said before, we rush to hit the diversity mark without hitting the equity and inclusion mark. And I think it's really hard to say, like for me as a hiring manager, it's very hard for me to say, I don't think that this space is safe for a trans person. And, you know, it's hard to admit that, and it's hard to admit that I maybe contribute to that, but it's an important part of transforming the space. And that's just an example that I'm using. It's hypothetical, but I'm sure that all of us, no matter how progressive that we are in our life, and no matter how hard we strive to advocate for different communities in our work, in our paid and unpaid work, we all have gaps to fill when it comes to that. So I think that a really important first step is being critical of ourselves and our roles in this, so that we can hold ourselves accountable and we can grow forward. And it's super annoying to be the person who's always like, what about this? What about that? Is this person going to be safe? Is that person going to be safe? I know how frustrating it is to be that person because I've been that person. But at the end of the day, if we really want to make this happen, we need to continue to ask those questions and be critical of ourselves and our workplaces and our systems. So I really think that that's like an important place to start. If we don't identify the problem, there's no way to solve it, right?
I think Sydney and Debbie's answers are so amazing, and it's really hard to build upon that because I really think you both have touched on so many important points. But I really just want to emphasize, Sydney, the point you just mentioned, your first point about accountability. It is so important to hold people accountable for their actions. You know, in the past few years with the Me Too movement and now with the Black Lives Matter movement, we've really been seeing how important accountability is and how we can transform institutions and structures to be better for everyone. And I think, you know, that might be something that kind of bounces off the previous question we had with bringing in a third party to perhaps establish those structures or make recommendations for, you know, procedures to hold people accountable for instances of harassment that are, you know, related to discrimination, and to ensure that there is an appropriate channel for voicing your concerns or voicing things that have happened to you in the workplace. Because without that, then there's no trust, and without transparency, there's no trust as well. So there needs to be a clear, you know, layout of what happens given certain situations so that people can be held accountable.
These are all amazing conversations that we're having, and just the knowledge that you are all sharing is so wonderful. I'm sure everyone on the call right now is getting a lot and taking a lot away from this, and I feel like we could just keep going and going, but what I want to do now is we're going to move into breakout rooms. So if you're on the call and you have some questions or you want to contribute, please bring those forward to the breakout rooms, so we can just kind of dive in a little bit deeper and just get a little bit more of a collaborative and intimate conversation with each other. So looking forward to seeing everybody in their respective breakout rooms. Probably be about a 20-minute conversation, and then we'll come back to the main plenary before we wrap up the session. Hi, everybody. As we all kind of collectively filter back into the main plenary, I just wanted to kind of echo what I just said in my breakout room with Debbie and Juanita, is just the absolute gratitude that I have for everyone coming into this space and feeling comfortable to share and to be vulnerable and to learn and unlearn with each other. I think that this is a conversation that, is not going to end with, the end of our hour-long session. And I encourage you, as I said, this was kind of intended as a bit of a kickoff, a networking space. So if you are comfortable and you want to kind of stay in touch, please reach out. The facilitators will drop our emails in the chat box. And we'll just kind of continue this conversation and continue to push forward the important work that we're all kind of trying to do on the back end with ourselves personally, and as we move forward in the workforce. And just really, really thankful for everybody. And big shout out and thank you to the facilitators today. I'm wondering if maybe each facilitator wants to take like 30 seconds and kind of share like a last thought, a key takeaway from the breakout room, and I will throw it to maybe Steph first to kick us off with that.
Sure. So I just want to echo what you said, and I want to really thank everyone for joining today. These conversations are so important to have, and the more we have them, the more productive we'll be, the more honest we'll be, and the more change will happen. A big takeaway from our breakout session is that it's really, really important to have people who are diverse in powerful positions and positions of power where they are the decision makers, because organizations can have, diversity in air quotes kind of in a certain context, but still have people who are in power who are not diverse. And ultimately, that's kind of the issue that we're still facing. So, and I also just want to emphasize that I think everyone, in society has a really important moral responsibility to educate themselves and to learn and unlearn. And, to be kind of a better person in the sense that you understand other people's experiences, other than people who just look like yourself. So thank you again to everyone. And I hope that everyone had really enjoyed this and has kind of tangible takeaways from this session.
I can go next. Some key takeaways is that, you as an organization can kind of set the standard of what relationships you have kind of fit with your values, and not to hesitate to do evaluations to determine whether or not organizations you're working with or wanting to partner with or want to partner with you are, kind of fit with where you're going when it comes to your D&I journey, and whether or not that's a relationship you want to continue. Job descriptions are a key factor in who you can recruit. And so making sure that you're saying what the wages or the wage scale is on there, because that not having it can actually prevent people from applying. And lastly, use resources like that I shared, community-centric fundraising and nonprofit AF on tips for leaders on not to put emotional tasks on the first or the only staff member, whether it's race, gender, etc. And to also protect yourselves as a person who might be put in that position. You can say no.
Yeah, and super quickly, I think what came up both in our earlier discussion and in our breakout room is, again, just really asking the people who are most affected what they need. Don't make assumptions. Really center the people who are experiencing these levels of harm in the organization, because they are the experts and they can let you know how much or how little they're willing to engage in this type of process. And I think it's really important to not do a bunch of work that in the end is not focusing on those issues that are the most urgent for the people who are most affected. So highly recommend. And I also shared a couple resources for some great consultants who do some of this work if you're interested in working with them.
Thanks again, everybody. I'm hoping we need to have a panel, Sydney, Stephanie, Juanita, Debbie, and just, keep going. I feel like this would be just an excellent conversation. I've just dropped in the chat. Please join us. Our GE Week 2020 closing ceremony is starting right now with spoken word artist Cassandra Myers. Just follow the link to register. Hope to see some of you there and have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care, everybody.